Hello, I'm Rahul Bhardwaj, the President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors. Welcome, and thank you for joining the latest in our series of webcasts discussing the governance impacts of the COVID-19 health and financial crisis. Today, we're discussing CEO succession planning against the backdrop of a global public health pandemic. Now, what happens if the CEO or a member of the C-suite needs to take a leave of absence? What types of scenarios do directors need to be prepared for? Now, more than ever, boards need to be intimately involved in succession plans and ensure succession planning remains a priority. To discuss this, I'm pleased to be joined today by George Lewis and Laryssa Topolnytsky. George is a director of Legal and General Group, a global asset and risk management company and the largest life insurer in the UK. He's also a director of Synovus Energy, AOG Group, and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Laryssa is a senior partner with the global leadership advisory firm Korn Ferry and a member of their CEO and board effectiveness practice. Laryssa specializes in CEO succession and advises boards on CEO effectiveness, HR strategy, and succession issues. Welcome, George, and welcome, Laryssa.
Thank you for
Now,
having me.
let's focus right on this pandemic. We've seen several high-profile CEOs step aside for health reasons, which has the potential to be highly disruptive. Now, in your experience, how prepared are boards to deal with the scenario of emergency succession, and what plans should be made for other members of the C-suite? And George, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Rahul. And I think that's a great question. And in many ways, I think boards are better prepared in the COVID-19 situation than they would otherwise be in other circumstances where the CEO needs to temporarily step aside for health or other reasons. The reason I say that is my experience to date on the boards that I sit on is that we have instituted procedures to get more frequent updates from management, whether it's a weekly update from the president written or weekly conference calls, which is more typical. So boards are typically, in my experience, more engaged during times of stress and crisis, and therefore, oddly, in a better position to make a decision, make a relatively quick decision on emergency CEO succession. And I would say in many cases, it's not necessarily the person who is a long-term successor who is put into that temporary or acting role, but somebody such as the COO or the CFO who might be intimately involved in some of the urgent issues that the company's dealing with at that time.
And Laryssa, what are you seeing these days?
I'm seeing something very similar, but it also makes me think of the next level down and the executive team and how important it is to think that through, because as we all know, this is different. At any given time now, it's impossible for more than one person to be sick, and at many times when we have many decisions to make. So it's incumbent, I think, for directors to work with their CHROs and their CEOs to take a look at the existing succession plan, frankly, and put names to roles if they haven't already. And to George's point, it might be more of an emergency thought process. And in doing so, it's also important, I would say, to tell those people you're on point to succeed, and to the extent possible, and there's time allowed and it's not overly confidential, to have those people in meetings, understanding the decisions that are being made, why they're being made, and frankly, capitalize on the development opportunity. The best learning does come on the roll, and so we advocate for that. I'd also add, beyond that director team, thinking through who, as George might have said, is on the peer group on the executive team who might take out small portions of a role and again, have them on point. And then if I think about concentric circles, who on the board could take on a role who has either CFO, COO, CHRO experience, who might have retired from the company, who's willing to come back and be on point, who's recently retired from another company with that expertise, who's willing to be on point. And then finally, what I've seen done that's a little innovative is boards turning to the professional services providers that have worked with CEOs and executive teams. A logical example would be some of the law firms in the Seven Sisters that I've worked with. Their GC has helped out in their legal department to step in. And frankly, even in our firm, we've helped some of the key leaders in the CHRO role as a stopgap if there needs to be help.
Great. So let's build out the conversation a little bit more then. So in a crisis condition like COVID, let's think about what should boards be thinking about in terms of CEO performance and succession, and what should they be considering as we enter into this post-pandemic phase as well? And I'll start with you again, Laryssa, this time.
Wow. When I think of performance, that's a pretty loaded word. And I think that about the CEOs, what their day jobs are normally like, how they spend their time, and how boards typically can work with them to optimize their performance. And now I layer on the pandemic and how everything is heightened. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on each of those and coming up with some practical examples of how boards can really augment that performance in the short term to get through that crisis, to survive it, and then frankly, put the company in a position to thrive on the other end. So if I think about a CEO, all of our directors know this, and I love my job because I think these are amazing people in that they're smart, they're achievement oriented, they're results oriented. It's remarkable the decisions they have to make and the pressure they're under, and there's no playbook, and yet they're held to account. So not surprisingly, in any regular situation, there's a lot of pressure, and they'll say it's lonely at the top. Layer on a pandemic, the hours go from 12 to 16 or 18. The decisions are that much more complex. The heat is on, and they're working on fewer hours, and the stakes are higher. So when I think of that, it's incumbent for boards to understand the complexity and how they can help first. Second, I think about how CEOs typically spend their days, and most effective ones in a regular period would divide it 50-50 between focusing on the strategy and the future and then on executing the second half. In a crisis, that shifts significantly to 80-90% immediate crisis reactive mode and the remainder forward thinking. So if you have those two elements at the top of your head, it's incumbent for boards to think through and empathize with some of that to then help to optimize the performance. And so the last piece, which is important, is how to do that is the regular way on one hand, but focusing more on a second. When I think of the regular way, it's helping with operations and execution. And the second is the moral support. So from an operations and execution standpoint, it's the same thought partnership. It's the same sharing of information. If you've been through a crisis personally and professionally, maybe you share your lessons on prioritization or perspective. Finally, on the operational piece, I'd say be kind. Don't ask for any more analysis that you don't need. Respect their time. Remember, they're working on fumes. The second bucket, which I would call heart, if the first is head, heart, is really appreciating that notwithstanding all those positive things I called out and making them superhuman-like and superhero-like, these CEOs are human. They're exhausted, they're frustrated, they're afraid, they're anxious, the weight is on their shoulders. And they could use as much moral support as possible to help sustain them through this time to get to the other side. So some practical things to think about is first and foremost, remember that. With that as an umbrella, if you're going to be speaking to them, ask them out of the gate, how are you feeling? How's it going? Some will probably say everything's fine. If you ask them again, how are you really? You might get another answer. Another thing that's really helpful is to encourage their self-care. Many are very good at working out and meditating and eating right, but it's the first thing to go, given being at a crisis. And then finally, I'll land on just simply thanking them. Send them texts, send them emails. We're grateful for what you're doing, and you and your team. Let us know how we can help.
That's some great stuff in there. And George, when you bring a director lens to this, what do you see?
Yeah, no, I think Laryssa's made some excellent points. I just think the first rule of support is do no harm. And so when thinking of constructing the necessary more frequent oversight, weekly call or weekly update, we've always insisted that we don't want any new materials created for that. That should all be existing materials that management and management committees use for their day-to-day decision making. And the second point, just to build on Laryssa's, is this element of hygiene when it comes to empathy and beginning every conversation with the check-in in terms of how are you doing, and to make it meaningful, and even in email correspondence to do the same, so that either your management team gets the sense that you as a director view them as more than just tools to run the business, but as complete, resilient human beings. And I think that's tremendously important in times like this.
No, it's good to hear now.
The only other, the only other
Go
thing
ahead.
I might add is because your question was on performance, and I like Laryssa's disaggregation of the task at hand, which is 90% get through the crisis and 10% think of the future. And there's nothing wrong with noting and observing management's performance and the CEO's performance through the piece, but I would deliberately hold that for a future board meeting or future succession discussions once the task at hand is finished.
No, very good point there. So let's move into sort of the post-COVID phase, if we can think of something like that. So the question is more or less, under normal circumstances, boards still struggle to include CEO succession as a part of their agendas. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on how boards should incorporate succession planning into their normal workflow. And do you have any advice on how to do that effectively? And Laryssa, perhaps I'll start with you.
Sure. You called it as it is. They are getting better overall, but they could still do better. And I think that they've come to appreciate that. And this crisis is going to energize them when they come out the other side. I think one easy way to do it, and many do, is make it part of the board agenda. And what I would advocate for, not just once a year, I would actually advocate for 4 times a year, 2 at the the first at the 6-month mark and the 12-month mark, going deeper and having regular check-ins and having just it on the agenda. The intention is twofold. First, you cultivate a culture of talking talent, if you will, and what gets measured gets done. So even if you have a 15-minute segment once a quarter, given the analyses you've done and a pulse on your talent, you can understand what situations they've used as learning, how are they shaping up, are the talent that you thought were ready for enterprise role truly ready, or might there be some surprises in the wings? That's one piece. And then second, I would advocate for it being part of the CEO's performance and agenda, and having him or her, again, advocate and sponsor executive development throughout the year.
So George, what are you seeing in the boardrooms that's working?
Yeah, very much the point that Laryssa just made, in the sense of not only making it part of the board agenda, which I agree with, but the way to operationalize that, I've found that works very effectively, is to make it part of the CEO's performance objectives. And most CEOs have a quantitative corporate scorecard component to their objectives, and then what I would advocate 2 or 3 strategic objectives to accomplish or to work on through the year. And one of those, in my view, should be talent development and CEO succession, whether you've just been appointed or whether you're reaching the 10 or 15-year mark. Probably more critical in the latter case, but always good to do. And that type of formality, I found, results in better outcomes than just waiting for the time when the CEO wants to retire or wants to move on, and then the board institutes an external search. And I've been through all different types of situations. One where in an emergency, a board member steps in, a wide external search. But probably the most satisfying I've been through is with a CEO who pretty well from day one began to look at his organization structure and began very thoughtfully to construct 2 or 3 roles as part of his team that offered people broader responsibilities. In this particular case, the CFO was given responsibility for strategy and risk and other aspects of the business. And we were able, when our CEO, as was his dream, got his dream job in the US for 4 times the amount of money, we were able to actually, because we felt we'd gone through the succession planning work, we were able to announce that successor to pretty well universal support within the company and outside the company at the same time as we announced our CEO departure. To me, that you can't always do that as a board, but I think that's a testament to how, if you're really confident in your CEO succession planning, a great thing to do if you can.
Interesting. Let's switch gears just a little bit now. We've spoken about CEO succession. Let's touch on board succession for a minute. Not much has really been said about emergency board succession plans as a part of COVID-19 discussion. But is that something that boards should be thinking about in addition to emergency CEO succession? And George, let's start with you. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if you look at the function of a board, which certainly, as you've described, Rahul, hindsight, oversight, and foresight, but it is a forward-looking strategic oversight function. And to me, that inherently is more longer term in nature, and therefore board succession tends to be more longer term in nature rather than on an emergency basis. And boards have gotten fairly good in my experience with skills matrix and assisted by able people like Laryssa in terms of planning for succession. So I don't necessarily think it should be as top of mind for boards as making sure that your management team is in place and you've got the people doing the 90% of the work in terms of getting through the crisis.
And Laryssa, what do you think about that?
I agree with everything that George said, and it did make me think of actually a real example that happened in our firm 4 weeks ago. And one of our esteemed directors fell ill and unfortunately passed, and we had to have an emergency replacement. And our CEO went out to a previous director who so graciously offered to come back in. So it happens.
It does, doesn't it? Well, now, before we sign off, I'd be very curious if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share. And George, I'll start with you. And Laryssa, you get to have the final word today.
Well, I think that we're going through a difficult time as boards, as managements, as society overall, and I think that coming back to Laryssa's points and others that I've mentioned, I think it's particularly important to show empathetic and servant leadership as a board members during this period of time. And we always try to be constructive in our questioning. I think we have to pay extra attention to the constructive part during these times.
Great words. Laryssa.
I'm a big fan of the heart part, as anyone who knows me and my leadership style, so I'll echo that. I'll also echo the value of using this crisis for learning as it relates to succession planning, not only for the CEO, but those on the executive team and in the wings, to use it as development. What we often find is people are put in boxes and labeled high potential, what have you, and then a half a year goes by and a year goes by and nothing changes in terms of their readiness. And while you would never wish anything bad on anyone, the best learnings come from a hardship, and some would qualify a crisis a hardship. And it's amazing learning to ramp up your team at the executive level to help that CEO develop enterprise leaders and position this company for success as they come out of this crisis.
That's great. And Laryssa, George, thank you so much for your wise counsel and for joining us today. And to our viewing audience, thank you for tuning in. Please look out for new installments of this series as we navigate these challenging times together. Keep well, and bye for now.